Lessons from the wise men. They weren't always wise. I've seen a number of videos through the years of the wise men, and the imagery is not always identical, but it tends to be in the direction of they started seeing a star in the east, somewhere in the east, and they followed it to Jerusalem, and when they got to Jerusalem, they sought out King Herod because he was the authority, and they were probably men under authority, and that would make a lot of sense. And then they got some further direction from him, and when he sent them out and they continued their journey toward Bethlehem, they picked up the star again. They were real happy about that. And in this instance, the star went and stood right over the house that they were in, Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus, somewhere between 6 months and a year and a half. I'm among those who thinks that probably was the age that he was. And they were warned by the Lord not to go back to Herod and to go back home, east, where in the east that was for them, and to do it by a different way. I don't believe the Bible teaches that, though that is commonly believed. Part of that happened, for sure. I think they made a classic mistake that all of us are vulnerable to. And the story, the birth of Christ, the coming of Christ, and the early days of Jesus, and the danger that he faced by virtue of Herod and his rage and his murderous ways. They were very dangerous days. They were very critical in the birth of Christ, and I mean that in the months, the immediate months, maybe the first 6 months, maybe the first year and a half. They were very, very serious days. A lot was on the line. So, in part, I'm trying to present, it's a major issue. This was not just kind of a light issue that was being faced, that the Gospels that Matthew chooses to record. This was, among the stories, my goodness, this and the end of Jesus' life and his suffering and his paying the price for all of us and his resurrection from the dead. I think that's an even greater story. That story would not have occurred had this one not occurred. That was the coming of Christ and the plan of God and his preparing the earth. So I've these thoughts kind of at the beginning. Lessons learned from the wise men. God will direct your path. Number 2, there are problems when we move away from God's direction in all of our lives, especially in all the time. In really big issues that we may be dealing with in our lives, there are problems when we clearly move away from God's direction. And number 3, God can help you recover from critical mistakes you may have made or are making. I believe these are messages from the Magi. Number 1, that he will direct your path. God will clearly direct your path. Number 2, that when we move off of God directing our path, that sets in motion problems. Number 3, the message from the Magi, so to speak, is that God can help you recover from critical mistakes, really big-time mistakes. I think the Magi made a big-time mistake. From really critical mistakes you may have made or are in the process of making. The redemptive story, the second chance, the story of the Magi is filled with that. It's the gospel. It was a very critical time. What I'd like to ask you to do is to try and look at the verses like you haven't read them or you're filled with videos, as I am, through the years. There are several videos that I love to watch concerning the birth of Christ, the coming of Christ, the coming of the Magi are usually included. And so I have lots of images that I know are in me. I just know as I chose this time, I'm going to continue, in essence, the Christmas stories. It's going to extend into January some, but I'm also among those who believe this didn't happen right away. This was at least 6 months down the road, could have been as much as a year, and up to a year and 6 months down the road. It was not the same scene as is often shown for convenience. Christ in the manger, and the shepherds are there, and then the wise men come, they follow him up or come at the same time. And I think some of the stunning truths that are taught by this time period, this section of Christ's story, are critical and fundamental. So I'm asking you to try and read the verses again, like you haven't read them before and you automatically know what it says or what it means. And here we go. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. I'm going to be using kind of a new version for me, the Berean Study Standard Bible. It is very similar to the King James, the New King James Version. It's quite a scholarly work. It's quite an accurate work, and it tries to incorporate even some of the newer manuscripts that have been discovered since the King James Version was done. It's extremely similar. So the Berean Standard Bible, the BSB, it reads pretty much like the New King James Version. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi, I think New King James Version says wise men, from the east arrived in Jerusalem. And what most people think is they got there because they followed the star there. It doesn't say that. Verse 2, asking, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? Read carefully. We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. All that's good. I think that's exactly what happened. They probably were astrologers, very versed in astronomy. I'm among those who think they could have been schooled by maybe even the writings or by Daniel. They have been schooled by him. And we're looking for the Christ and looking for a star, and maybe had been influenced by the role that Daniel played. Now, notice there's a change here. Asking. They came asking. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We got here. How did we get here? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. I think the easiest way to translate this is, while they were in the east, a star began to appear in the heavens. They were wise men. They were astrologers. They were magi. They had some knowledge and learning regarding the stars. They recognized it was a new star, and they attributed it possibly through what Daniel had taught and was available in his writings, that it was attributed to, in Jerusalem, for the Jews, there was a king, and it was his star. I believe they interpreted that from the east. And they chose, however long that journey was, a very long journey, they chose, don't have any idea how many there were. There could have been 3, there could have been 5, there could have been 12. There could have been a whole group of people. They journeyed to Jerusalem. And they started asking questions. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. I want to suggest they started the journey being led by God through a star that they had understanding of, that they knew it was the birth of a king. And they knew it was the birth, it represented, I don't know how, of the Jewish king. That led them to Jerusalem. I don't believe the scripture teaches that when they left the east, they followed that star because it led them right to Jerusalem. The scriptures do not say that. It says the star, they saw a star. It's clear from the scriptures. They interpreted that as the birth of a Jewish king. And so they went to the capital that would have been Jerusalem at that time period. And then they sought a different direction. They went to people. Don't think the scripture teaches they went straight to Herod, as the next verse will make it clear. They went to people. It wasn't people that got them there. I believe what got them to Jerusalem was the revelatory guidance of God. It was supernatural. They pursued it. I'm assuming at great price, and I mean by that the price of time, the price of resources, the price of safety issues, the price of the kind of desert they had to cross through, most likely. They paid significant prices. They followed God. Now it changes. That is what I believe was the mistake of the Magi. They got to Jerusalem following God. They knew enough from that star that they saw rise. So I've included the Passion Bible. I've read many different versions, but the Passion Bible is quite interesting. This is the same verse, chapter 2, what amounts to Matthew chapter 2, verse 2. And inquired of the people, where is the child who is born King of the Jewish people? We observed his star rising in the sky, and we've come to bow before him in worship. I believe their heart was right. I believe their intentions was right. I believe their motives were right at that point in time. I believe they got there by pursuing the leadership of God in a very unusual fashion. But when they got to Jerusalem, they began to seek the help of others. I think I've included Matthew chapter 2, verse 3. When King Herod heard of this, I don't believe they went to King Herod. I believe they entered Jerusalem. They started asking questions of the people. Okay, we emphasizing it. We have been led here by a star that we saw arise when we were in the east, that we understand is the birth star of a new king of the Jewish people. And so we have come to where we believe you should pursue that, and that would be the capital city. So we have come to the capital. Can you tell us, where is the king, the man, the child, where is he that is born King of the Jews? That information somehow made it through the people, and it got to Herod. Matthew chapter 2, verse 3, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. That was not a sound that he wanted to hear. I think it went more along this lines, not that the Magi, the wise men, came to him and sought an audience with him, and, "Sir, we are here because we saw the star of the birth of a king of the nation of Israel, and so we've come to the capital city and we've come to you. And so we're asking you." I do not believe that's what occurred. They were led by God. They started seeking guidance from people, where they got there following God. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. I think it spread all over. And the turmoil of King Herod got set in motion. How everybody in the city, so to speak, heard about it, I don't know what the communication system was, but it became known, I'll say far and wide, in Jerusalem. Matthew 2:4. And when he had assembled, he, King Herod, went right to the religious leaders, the Jewish religious leaders. And when he had assembled all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. It's clear Herod became well aware of what was the question these magi were asking. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? So he assembled the religious leaders in Jerusalem, and maybe beyond, I don't know that, but at least in Jerusalem. Herod assembled them and asked them the question, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? Matthew 2:4. I've skipped the two verses where they read to him out of Micah chapter 5, which describes Bethlehem as the birthplace. Matthew 2:7. Then Herod called the Magi secretly, so he had a meeting with them then. He had an answer for their question. Herod had an answer. But they were sent on this journey by the star that I believe God caused to be raised in the sky. Do I think it was a normal star? For me, it's easier to say, I think it was probably more an angel. But it could have been a special creation. I mean, this was the birth of the Christ. Everything revolved around Jesus coming. So could God have created a new entity that existed for a short time period? Of course he could have. But note that their guidance changed. Up to this point in time, the Magi, the wise men, their guidance was a new star that came into being. Be it an angel in the appearance of a star, be it an entity that was temporarily placed into the heavens. That's what they followed. But now they're following King Herod. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and learned from them the exact time the star appeared. I think it went along these lines. Okay, can you tell me about this star? Because he was the current reigning king, I think in their position, they gave respect to him. I think they answered the question as accurately as they knew how to answer it. And it could have been, I don't know, because the time period for their journey had to be taken into account also. So it was a bit of a complicated question that included when they first saw it, how long have they been traveling. Those are all things that I believe had to come out in this conversation, this secret meeting that Herod had with the wise men. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and learned from them the exact time the star had appeared. Wait, now tell me exactly about this. So he learned that. Verse 8, Matthew chapter 2, verse 8. And sending them to Bethlehem, their guidance system was Herod. Prior to all this, their guidance system was the revelatory grace that had been given to them in this star. I think the mistake they made was when they got to Jerusalem, they didn't, we think that star led us here. Where do we go from here? Is the mistake that they made. They then went to people. And they ended up having a new guidance system. Ultimately, it was Herod. Matthew 2:8. And sending them to Bethlehem. Herod was directing. Now, he said, go and search carefully for the child. He gave them directions. He gave them assignment. He gave them the task. Now Herod's reputation. He murdered one of his wives. He murdered three. His reputation. He had murdered three of his sons. There was all kinds of people he had out of his that they revolted. At least history seems to suggest that. He was a very, very, very wicked man. Would they have known all that? I don't know all that they knew about Herod. I don't know all that they knew. And they went on their way. After they had heard the king, verse 9, I think I accidentally touched it. Steve, can you back it up to verse 8? 1, please. Thank you. And sending them to Bethlehem, he said, go and search carefully for the child. He gave them assignment. Go and search carefully for the child, and when you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him. They were now being directed by Herod. I think it was the mistake. And I think to some degree, they promised Herod, it's what makes sense to me. They promised Herod, to some degree, at some level, we will do this. But they were following a whole different guidance system. Go and search carefully for the child. So he assumed, which they may have assumed, which we may assume, that was Bethlehem. I've read many articles, haven't this week, because I've really been curious and I really wanted to know. I just seemed like they've made a mistake. Along the way, they made a huge mistake. You enabled them to recover. But anything that I read, nobody's addressed that. And I read estimates. How many ultimately babies do they think were massacred? They think in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 babies. In part, it depends how wide an area. We know that the slaughter certainly did Bethlehem, but regions that were around it, how much did that incorporate? We don't know that. But when you find him, go and search carefully. The impression is it was believed, at least on Herod's part, and maybe on their part, this is going to be a bit of a task. How are you going to know? Let's say they knew there were about 30 male children that would have been typically in that area. How will they know which one is it? I think it's very interesting what happens next. I think God understood. He began to correct the mistake that they had made. And he makes a phenomenal move. He gives them an advanced GPS system that points to the very house in Bethlehem. So let's say there were 30 young men, children, babies, 30 boys, male babies at that time. So let's say there were 30 possible homes, but every home didn't have one. So were they going to go knock on every door? How were they going to do it? God caused that to be no problem whatsoever, because the star came back into vision again, and stopped, and was of such a nature that it actually pointed out the very house. They returned to God leading. Search carefully for the child, and when you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him. I think to some degree they made a promise they would do that. They knew to go to Jerusalem. They learned from Herod and the religious leaders, Jewish religious leaders, it would have been in Bethlehem, about 3-4 miles away to the south. 3 or 4 miles to the south of Jerusalem is where Bethlehem is. Not far. So go and search carefully for the child. And when you find him, implying, okay, this may take a bit of effort. Go and search carefully for the child, and when you find him, report to me. So he was directing. As the story starts in Matthew 2:1 and 2, is they saw a star arise, and they knew it was king. They knew it was a Hebrew king, Jewish. They pursued. The scriptures do not say that star led them straight to Jerusalem. I think by virtue of authority, they pursued Jerusalem and went there, so that I too may go and worship him. It continues, Matthew 2:9. After they had heard the king, they went on their way. I think they left, say, the king's palace. Okay, we got it. But God changed it. And the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stood over the place where the child was. God stepped back in. I think we, by virtue of history, by virtue of all kinds of things, have envisioned the star arose, the star led them to Bethlehem, Jerusalem. They go to Jerusalem. They sought the help of people. They got their answer through Herod, who sought the help of religious leaders. And they began the short journey from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. And they picked up the star again, and they followed the star the last several miles. It's not what happened. And the mistake, the common mistake, started on a journey by God, changed because we replaced seeking God's guidance. Okay, we've gotten so far. Now what do? They sought people. Jerusalem became aroused. Herod heard it. He's real aroused. He seeks the answer of the Jewish rabbis, students. They find it in Scripture. He tells them they're now under his guidance. He gives them, be real thorough, men, and when you find him, I want to come back and tell me, and you, because you've done the searching, come back and tell me, and I will, because I want to come and worship him too. And they left under that, except they get outside of Jerusalem, maybe instantly, maybe a mile down the road, the star appears again. I think their reaction in the next verse, to me, confirms that this is more the scenario. They start leaving Jerusalem, and they see the star again. And they are so excited because they see the star again. Reads like this. And they went on their way, and the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them. They had seen it in the east. Went ahead of them until it stood over the place where the child was. Verse 10. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with great delight. This again is the Berean Standard Bible. They rejoiced with exceeding great joy, I think the New King James says. Their emotional reaction to seeing that star again, to me, the easiest explanation of that is they hadn't been seeing. They saw it to start the journey. Now they see it again. And it leads them right there to the house. I read this from the Passion Bible. And on their way to Bethlehem, the same star they had seen in the east suddenly reappeared, amazed. They watched as it went ahead of them and stopped directly over the place where the child was. I think that's what happened. God preempted a long search because there's time now that has to be dealt with. Because of what I believe was their mistake, it set in motion a time clock. The time that is present at the moment is probably a little more time than not, because they're going to have to search. God preempted a search. I tend to think it was an angel, but it certainly could have been a unique heavenly object that God brought into being just exactly for this time in history because of many reasons, among them the magnitude of the moment. And it went ahead of them and stopped directly over the place where the child was. That's the Passion version. And I've entitled this, The God of Second Chances, the Gospel of Jesus Christ. Why did God do this? Because it's the gospel. It's what it's all about. Why do I think he permitted this? Because in and of itself, it is the gospel. God gave them a second chance. Yes, there were impact, there were consequences. Do I think God knew in advance what decision they were going to make, and he let them make it? Yes, I do. There was prophetic words from many years before about what was going to take place as a result. That was when Herod launched his murderous ways. The scriptures had already spoken to it. The God of second chances. I believe the message of the Magi includes a realization, an explanation that God is the God of second chances. At this pivotal time in history and redemption story, God intervened. Reading out of the Passion Bible, verse 10. And when they saw the star, they were so ecstatic that they shouted and celebrated with unrestrained joy. It's not a stretch to me, the words that the New King James Version uses, that, okay, that may have been a little more the flavor of the great joy that they responded with. And when they saw the star, they were so ecstatic that they shouted and celebrated with unrestrained joy. So they're on the short road now. They're back under God's guidance. Matthew 2:11. On coming to the house, they saw the child, so they knew which house. It's different than the shepherds. The shepherds were told by, I think God has, there's so many ways that he can choose to guide. The shepherds, they saw, at least initially, a lone angel in the sky and eventually a host. I don't know all the creatures, the heavenly creatures that were in that host. But this will be a sign to you'll find the babe, to the shepherds, wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. They knew exactly where to go. They didn't have to search all the homes in Bethlehem because they knew where that was. They knew where the swaddling clothes were. They knew where the manger was because that was the birthing area for the flock, the lambs that were the sacrificial lambs. That was their responsibility to tend to them, watch over them, nurture them, help them in the birthing, wrap them in the swaddling clothes to protect their legs in the birthing. They knew exactly where that was. God used a completely different system to show the Magi, I'm going to show you where it is. Exactly. It was the star that landed over that house. So do I think there was a long tail appendage to the star? Could be. Do I think it was so crystal clear that there was no mistaking, okay, which house among these houses, the dwelling places that we see in Bethlehem, which house is it? Personally, and I think the scriptures bear it out, it was crystal clear. Right there. That's where you go. Right there. They were now being guided by God. They started their journey being guided by God. Matthew 2:11. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. We interpret it in general. There were three of them. You may not, but in general, we interpret there were three of them, and each one had there could have been multiple that had a gift of gold. And we don't know. However many there were, they started a journey that was God initiated. And it was important. In the middle of the journey, they sought other direction. And they made seemingly agreements. Seeming. And dreams and the kingdom, Matthew 2:12. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, God continues his involvement with them. Here's what I think happened. And having been warned in a dream, they spent a night. They may have spent multiple nights. They began to spend a night. Maybe they had a whole elaborate tent system, which they had to have of some degree because it was a long journey over the desert. So when they spent nights, they had to have their camping gear. Did they go to the local motel? They could have. Was it full? It was a different time now. At least 6 months have gone by. But they went to bed. So this encounter took place. They went to bed. They set up camp. I'm not sure how, no one can be sure. But I do know God spoke to them in a dream. So they went to bed. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, God changed Herod's plans. Boy, that was interesting. He chose a dream. He could have chosen an angel like he did to the shepherds 6 months ago, a year and a half maximum. He could have done that. He could have spoken audibly to them. It was fairly important. God was providing time for Joseph and Mary and Jesus to escape to Egypt. In part, he shortened the time, how long it took them to find this child. The star reappeared. They were delighted about it. They made the few miles journey. Maybe they got there in the afternoon. I don't know. I don't know how quickly. Could have been horses they were riding. Could have been camels. We don't know. When they left Jerusalem, they could have been there late in the afternoon of that same day. I don't know. But they knew exactly where to go. They learned from Herod what town to go to. The sign that God gave them. They knew exactly what to do. I think The analogy is classic. We can start on a journey, an assignment that's clearly initiated by God. Along the journey, maybe because we become uncertain, maybe because of the passage of time, we come to a place where we don't know what to do. It's very understandable. I think their hearts were good. I don't think they were mean-willed. I think they were good-willed. Made the mistake of seeking another source of guidance when the guidance that they had been given initially had come to conclusion, Jerusalem. Was there forgiveness? Absolutely. They make it there. They come in, they see the young child, they see Mary. It doesn't say they see Joseph. I'm assuming he was around. He took them to Egypt, so I know he was around. They presented their gifts. They went to bed. Do I think they shared supper? They may have. Set up camp. That's what I think probably happened. They could have stayed in the inn, though the inn was guest rooms. At least that's what's spoken of initially. There's no room in the inn. It was guest rooms. And they have a dream. And in the dream, God warns them, do not go back to Herod. You go back home another way. However that was communicated, they understood that. They withdrew to their country by another route. They again were following God. Then the scripture says, and I'll close here, Matthew 2:13. When the Magi had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. I get the impression that the Magi were warned. I get the impression that when they got up, or they began to get up then, and then they left, it could have been that Joseph and Mary went back to bed still that night. It may have been that Joseph and Mary spent the day wondering, stunned, bewildered, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. What was this all about? They knew some. What they knew was so small compared to what they were going to begin to experience, because they had the Christ, and they were just learning what all this means. Then Joseph has a dream. So it could have been, but the Magi had left. So that means could have been the same night, could have been that they, though the scripture doesn't tend to say they got up immediately and they hightailed it out of there. It doesn't seem to imply that about the Magi. Do I think they left the next day? At a minimum, they left the next day. Could have been Joseph and Mary and Jesus spent another day and another night. It could have been a nap that Joseph took, bewildered, all the things that had taken place. Could have been the same night. Could have been. I'm suggesting when you read this account and you make different assumptions, that it was started by God, they got as far as that took them, And it wasn't ill will. They were good-willed. They just started asking people. That spread. Herod heard it. He asked the religious leaders. He calls them. Here's where it is. I want you to tell me when you exactly saw that thing. How long? I'm sure he asked them, how long have you been on the road? When did you start your journey? To arrive at a time period. It could have been that adding in all the journey and when they started seeing it. Okay, it's in Bethlehem. It's not far from here. I want you to go and search real careful, and then I want you to come back to me and tell me, because I want to go and do what you're going to go and do, and that is worship Him. I want to go and worship Him. God intervened. I don't believe it was ill will on the part of the Magi, the wise men. I believe it was a mistake, but I don't believe it was ill will. And God, in His grace, God of second chance, the gospel, there's redemption. There's provision for even mistakes we make by mistake. There's a core message of those who come to Jesus. It was basically the shepherds who were the ones who authorized the redemptive lambs that were born there. And it was basically the wise men who made it could have been a catastrophic mistake in their choices. But there was redemption, because it's what the whole story is really about. The redemptive grace of God. The wise men were very wise when they recognized, from my perspective, God was guiding them again. They embraced it. And they did what He said. So he got up, Matthew 2:14. So he, Joseph, he got up, took the child and his mother by night, and withdrew to Egypt. I want to finish this story of that story next Sunday. The Magi, God of second chances. I believe it's a phenomenal declaration of the redemptive forgiveness of God. And things get set in motion when we make decisions. And there's grace